Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me today. Welcome. A lot of discussions about the history of space exploration really focus strongly on the space race of the 1960s, with some discussion of the early shuttle era, the Hubble Space Telescope, and some later things. To be clear, the space race was an incredible time in history, and the Apollo landings really represent one of the pinnacles of human achievement thus far. But today, I would like to focus on the more recent history of space exploration, really the 21st century of crewed spaceflight. Now, in the interest of time, I've decided to limit our discussion to the American space program, NASA. There have been some amazing achievements by various other nations in the last 20 years in the field of spaceflight, including Russia, China, Japan, and the European Space Agency, among others. I don't want to downplay these achievements. I merely want to focus our discussion on those here in the United States. Again, in the interest of time, we're also going to focus mostly on the crewed space program. So, during the last 20 years, robotic space exploration has done incredible things. Probes have traveled from Mars to Mercury to the outer solar system, and new satellite technologies constantly aim to improve life for us here on Earth. Again, I don't want to downplay these achievements. I merely want to focus our discussion toward human spaceflight.
We have a go for main engine start. We have main engine start. 4, 3, 2, 1. We have booster ignition and liftoff of the Space Shuttle Endeavour with the first American element of the International Space Station, uniting our efforts in space to achieve...
By the year 2000, the Space Shuttle had been flying for nearly 20 years. Designed during the 60s and 70s, the Space Shuttle was the world's first reusable spacecraft. It was designed to ferry crew and cargo between the Earth and low Earth orbit. The shuttle program faced many problems getting off of its feet. The high operating cost of the reusable space shuttle meant that it struggled to compete with the single-use expendable rockets it was meant to replace. Technical issues constantly plagued the program, and the tragic loss of the shuttle Challenger in 1986 grounded the fleet for many years. Despite this, by the 1990s, the shuttles were finally finding their place, carrying many scientific missions and some interplanetary probes. One of NASA's biggest aspirations was to use their shuttles as the launch vehicle for a massive orbital space station. The agency struggled to find enough funding for this station, and it was ultimately delayed for decades. Then, in late 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. NASA saw a huge opportunity for partnership with the newly independent Russian space agency. This is important for two main reasons. Firstly, the Russians had a huge amount of experience building and operating space stations, far more than NASA had. And secondly, Russia did not have a lot of money at this point. And so the United States government thought it might be a good idea to keep these brilliant, incredibly talented Russian rocket scientists employed in Russia and not, say, with North Korea or somewhere else. So, in 1993, the Clinton administration approved a plan to combine the Russian and American space station proposals. Together with Japan, Canada, and Europe, the International Space Station was born. NASA first visited the existing Russian Mir space station in the early 90s, and the first pieces of the ISS were assembled in 1998. The station grew rapidly at first. NASA expected to continue constructing the ISS with their space shuttles every few months throughout the 2000s. On January 16, 2003, the Space Shuttle Columbia, the oldest of the space shuttles, launched on its 28th mission. The plan was not to visit a space station, just to perform a solo flight conducting scientific research in low orbit for around 2 weeks. On the morning of Saturday, February 1st, the shuttle broke apart while re-entering the Earth's atmosphere on its way home. All 7 astronauts were lost. To say that this tragedy shaped the space program is honestly an understatement. NASA had built 5 operational shuttles and now had lost 2 of them. That's a 40% failure rate across the fleet. The cause of the accident, in particular, is very significant. Columbia had disintegrated because of a design flaw. At launch, a piece of insulation from the shuttle's orange external tank had fallen off and ripped a hole in the vehicle's heat shield. That heat shield is critical to protecting the shuttle as it re-enters the Earth's atmosphere at orbital velocity. When it made contact with the atmosphere, traveling at 17,000 miles an hour, hot gases were able to enter Columbia's wing and destroy the vehicle. Not only could this problem occur again on any of the remaining shuttles, it actually had already happened several times before, most famously on Space Shuttle Atlantis in 1988, which was nearly lost due to a similar accident. Worst of all, the Accident Review Board found that NASA was aware of the issue but chose to ignore it, largely failing to recognize how serious it was. These foam strikes to the heat shield actually continued to happen for the rest of the program, though NASA would learn how to reduce the potential damage.
4, 3, 2, 1. And ignition and liftoff of Ares 1X. Testing concepts for the future of new rocket design.
The 3 remaining space shuttles would all return to space, with improved safety features. But everyone at NASA knew their days were numbered. They completed primary construction of the International Space Station, and then were retired in 2011. From this point on, the United States had no way of sending crew to the space station they just finished building. For the next 10 years, until a replacement was finished, the US was reliant on its Russian partners, essentially buying tickets on Russia's Soyuz spacecraft to get to the International Space Station. Replacing the space shuttle ended up being a pretty complicated process. In 2005, Congress approved a new program named Constellation, which NASA Administrator Mike Griffin called Apollo on steroids. The plan was to create a new crew exploration vehicle named Orion, which would essentially be a larger, reusable, modernized version of the Apollo spacecraft from the 1960s. NASA would then develop a series of launch vehicles, the Ares rockets, to carry Orion and other Constellation program hardware into space. These Ares rockets would be based heavily on the space shuttle, and even used leftover shuttle parts to simplify their design. Using the smaller Ares 1 rocket, NASA could send the Orion spacecraft to the International Space Station. When partnered with the larger Ares 5 rocket and a lunar lander, Orion would be able to return human beings to the moon for the first time since the last Apollo mission in 1972. This entire constellation framework would later be expanded to send human beings onto Mars. On paper, Constellation was a very robust system. It was allegedly 10 times safer than the space shuttle. It could carry a crew of 6 astronauts to the International Space Station, and could fly to the moon or beyond and remain in space for months, far longer than the shuttle could.
6,
5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And liftoff at dawn. The dawn of Orion and a new era of American space exploration.
In its initial approval of the Constellation program, the Bush administration outlined a plan for Orion to first fly in 2012 and for it to return humans to the moon by 2018. The eagle-eyed among you will note that this didn't happen, and humans did not return to the moon in 2018 or indeed since then. The reason for this is that ultimately most of Constellation would end up being cancelled. A 2009 review of the program found that the Constellation program was both significantly over budget and significantly behind schedule. A year later, funding was cancelled for both Ares rockets, which at this point had only flown a single test flight. Notably, however, though both Ares rockets were cancelled, the Orion spacecraft, which would have carried the astronauts, was not. To carry Orion to the moon, a new rocket was designed. This rocket has essentially never been given a name. It's referred to as the Space Launch System, or SLS. This may be confusing. The SLS looks very similar to the Ares 5 rocket it replaced, but they are decently different from an engineering perspective, despite both being orange. They also both are made of old shuttle parts, literally, as the engines and boosters are directly salvaged off of the retired shuttles. However, unlike Ares, the SLS actually exists. As of the making of this video, the first SLS and Orion are currently sitting fully assembled in Florida, essentially ready to roll out to the launch pad in 2022 after it completes some additional tests. This mission will be a part of NASA's new Artemis program, which aims to actually, really, seriously, for real this time, return human beings to the moon in the 2020s. The first flight of Orion and SLS, which is simply called Artemis 1, will be an uncrewed test flight similar to the early Apollo missions like Apollo 4 and 6. Assuming Artemis 1 goes well, we should expect follow-up missions to carry human beings back to the moon with the help of a lunar space station and a privately operated lander, all intended to be launched in the next few years.
3, 2, 1. Liftoff. On the shoulders of Atlas, the SS Deke Slayton II orbital ATK Cygnus spacecraft soars toward the International Space Station.
I mentioned that the lunar lander is a commercially operated vehicle, which is honestly a great segue for me to talk about the growth of commercial spaceflight in the US during the 21st century. Since its foundations in the space race, NASA has always been heavily involved with private companies. We can think back to the Apollo Saturn V, which was manufactured by no less than 6 different contractors. But ultimately, these contractors didn't operate the rockets, they only built them. This really started to change in the 1980s, when more and more satellites started to be built commercially. Then, in 1990, we see the first fully private launch vehicle reach orbit, the Pegasus rocket. NASA really wanted to encourage this growth, and they had a specific goal in mind. See, we've been focusing on how astronauts get to the International Space Station, and even after Constellation was canceled and Orion was delayed, NASA could still buy seats on Russian spacecraft. But another function of the Space Shuttle that was lost when it was retired was its ability to deliver supplies to the ISS. Right, what are the astronauts going to eat exactly? So, starting in 2005, NASA created a series of programs where private companies began competitively bidding for contracts to deliver cargo to the International Space Station. Unlike previous programs where NASA really operated the entire system, under this new arrangement, private companies were really responsible for the entire end-to-end operation. NASA would give them the cargo, pay for the service, and then it was the responsibility of the company to design and operate these robotic spacecraft and get it to the space station. The companies would pitch their designs to NASA, and then NASA would pick whichever design it liked best and award them the contracts. From these programs, we see the development of a couple different American spacecraft, including Northrop Grumman's Cygnus, SNC's miniature robotic space shuttle, and also the mostly reusable Falcon 9 and Dragon system developed by SpaceX, who today have become one of the real big names in the space industry. The commercial cargo program would prove to be a pretty big success. We saw the first private spacecraft dock to the ISS in 2012, and since then there have been over 40 robotic cargo launches and counting. With robotic commercial cargo missions being a success, and with the Orion spacecraft really focusing on lunar exploration, the US still lacked the ability to send crew to the International Space Station. With this in mind, NASA created the Commercial Crew Program, where companies were asked once again to develop a spacecraft, this time not to carry cargo, but indeed NASA astronauts. NASA ultimately awarded Boeing and SpaceX contracts to develop crewed spacecraft. Because these are commercially owned vehicles, The respective owners can operate them however they wish, outside of the agreed upon NASA contracts, as we saw when SpaceX launched private tourists to orbit in September of 2021.
1-0. Release and liftoff. As the countdown to Mars continues, the perseverance of humanity launching the next generation of robotic.
And that brings us to today. NASA's Commercial Crew program is carrying humans back to the space station, and the Artemis program is preparing to launch Orion around the moon and return humanity to another world for the first time in half a century. NASA has since expanded their commercial approach to spaceflight into other fields, such as privatizing the design of the lunar lander and other lunar cargo spacecraft for the Artemis program. The last 20 years have been an incredible ride for crewed US space programs, changing from the Space Shuttle to the International Space Station to the growing commercial spaceflight market we see today. And remember, I haven't even mentioned the growth of suborbital private space tourist flights, which carry humans to the edge of space and straight back down again, as we've seen in companies like Virgin Galactic and Blue Origin just within the last year. Thanks you guys so much for coming along with me as we explore the last 20 years of spaceflight. It's been really interesting seeing how historical trends have really influenced where we are today and where we're going in the future. And I'm really excited to see how things continue to evolve over the next couple of years. Thanks again for watching. Have a great day.